Stand today on the banks of the Seine in central Paris. Traffic moves across bridges. Tour boats pass beneath stone arches. The towers of Notre Dame dominate the island at the center of the river. Now remove everything modern. It is the late 9th century. The city is much smaller. Most of Paris fits onto a single island in the river, La Ile de la Cité. Wooden houses crowd inside crude defensive walls. Church bells ring nervously. Downstream, dark shapes appear on the water. Longships. Hundreds of them. The Vikings are coming.
To understand why Vikings reached Paris, we need to look at Europe in the 9th century. The once powerful empire of Charlemagne had fractured after his death in 814. His successors struggled to maintain control over vast territories stretching from the Pyrenees to the Rhine. Internal conflicts weakened the Carolingian world. Meanwhile, Viking groups from Scandinavia had begun expanding outward. They sailed across the North Sea and into European river systems, searching for wealth, tribute, and opportunities for settlement. The Seine River provided a direct path inland, and along that river lay one of the most important cities in the region, Paris.
Paris in the 9th century was nothing like the vast metropolis we know today. The city's core population lived primarily on the Ile de la Cité, a small island in the Seine. This location offered several advantages: natural protection from river currents, limited access points that could be defended, control of river traffic through bridges. Outside the island were scattered settlements, farmland, and religious communities, but these areas were much less secure. Population estimates suggest perhaps 3,000 to 5,000 people lived in and around Paris during this time. Compared with modern Paris's millions, it was a very small urban center. Yet politically and strategically, it was extremely important. 2 bridges connected the island to the mainland, one on each side of the Seine. These bridges were critical infrastructure. They allowed goods and people to move across the river, but they also served as defensive barriers. Towers were built at the bridgeheads, creating choke points against attackers approaching by water. The city also had defensive walls, though they were far less massive than Roman fortifications in cities like Constantinople. Most buildings were constructed from timber. Streets were narrow and irregular. Workshops and houses stood side by side. Livestock sometimes moved freely through urban spaces. Paris was a modest medieval town, but its bridges gave it enormous strategic value.
Viking expeditions into Francia began earlier in the 9th century. Their ships were uniquely suited for river navigation. Long, narrow hulls, shallow drafts, ability to sail or row. These vessels could travel deep inland along rivers like the Seine, Loire, and Rhine. Early Viking raids targeted monasteries and small settlements. Religious communities often possessed valuable objects made of gold and silver, but had little military protection. Gradually, however, the scale of Viking operations increased. Instead of small raiding parties, large fleets began entering rivers and threatening major towns. Paris eventually became one of their most significant targets.
In 885 AD, a massive Viking fleet sailed up the Seine toward Paris. Contemporary sources describe hundreds of ships and thousands of warriors. While exact numbers are uncertain, the scale was clearly extraordinary. The Vikings demanded passage upriver and tribute. Paris refused. At the time, the city's defense was led by Count Odo, a Frankish noble responsible for protecting the region. When negotiations failed, the Vikings launched an attack.
The bridges of Paris became the center of the conflict. Viking forces attempted to destroy the wooden bridge structures that blocked their ships from sailing further upstream. Defenders fought from towers and barricades. Accounts describe arrows and spears raining down from defensive positions, Viking warriors attempting to burn or break the bridge, repeated assaults against the fortified island. The defenders managed to hold the bridges despite intense pressure.
Because the bridges blocked the river, Viking ships could not easily bypass the city. This turned the confrontation into a long siege rather than a quick raid.
For the people of Paris, the siege created enormous strain. Food supplies became uncertain, trade along the river stopped, the threat of attack was constant. Residents lived with the sound of battle outside the walls, smoke from burning siege equipment, fear of famine and disease. Yet the island's defenses proved resilient. The combination of river barriers, bridges, and fortified positions allowed the smaller Frankish force to resist a much larger Viking army. This resilience became legendary in later chronicles.
The siege of Paris lasted for months, stretching into 886 AD. Viking forces attempted various strategies: assaults on the bridge towers, siege engines and battering attacks, attempts to starve the defenders. At one point, heavy flooding damaged one of the bridges, creating a dangerous gap in the defenses. Even then, the defenders continued resisting Viking advances. Count Odo famously left the city at one stage to seek reinforcements from the Frankish king. The siege became one of the most dramatic confrontations between Viking raiders and Carolingian defenders.
Problem: Viking expansion placed enormous pressure on the fragmented Carolingian world. Major rivers gave raiders access to wealthy inland settlements. Change: cities like Paris were forced to strengthen their defenses and develop more coordinated military responses. Consequence: the successful defense of Paris elevated the reputation of Count Odo and demonstrated that Viking forces could be resisted. In later years, Odo would even become king of West Francia, partly because of his leadership during the siege. Paris's resistance helped shape the political future of the region.
Eventually, the Viking siege ended not with a decisive battlefield victory, but through negotiation. The Frankish king Charles the Fat agreed to pay tribute and allowed the Viking army to move further upriver. This decision frustrated many defenders, including those in Paris who had fought so hard to hold the city. Nevertheless, the siege had lasting consequences. It revealed both the vulnerability and the resilience of Carolingian cities. It also reinforced Paris's importance as a strategic stronghold along the Seine.
Over the following centuries, Paris slowly expanded beyond the Ile de la Cité. New neighborhoods developed along both banks of the river. Stone construction gradually replaced many timber structures. Major religious buildings began to rise, including the early forms of institutions that would later shape the medieval city. By the 12th century, Paris would become one of the most important cities in Europe, home to a major university, powerful churches, and a growing royal administration. But in the late 9th century, its survival was not guaranteed. Modern Paris stretches far beyond the small island that once held the entire city. Today, millions of people live in the metropolitan area. Wide boulevards cross the city. Monumental buildings dominate the skyline. In the Viking era, however, Paris was essentially an island fortress surrounded by farmland and small settlements. Yet one crucial element remains unchanged. The Seine River still defines the city. For trade, transportation, and defense, it has always been the lifeline of Paris.
The Viking siege of Paris was more than a dramatic military episode. It symbolized a broader historical transition. The old Roman world had disappeared. The Carolingian Empire was fragmenting. New political powers were emerging across Europe. Cities like Paris were adapting to this unstable environment. They strengthened defenses, reorganized political leadership, and began evolving into the medieval urban centers that would later dominate European history. Today, Paris is one of the most famous cities in the world. But more than 1,000 years ago, it was a small island settlement facing one of the most powerful Viking forces ever assembled in Western Europe. The defenders did not have enormous armies or massive walls like Constantinople. What they had was a strategic location, determined leadership, and a city that refused to surrender. When the Viking ships finally withdrew, Paris remained standing, and from that small fortified island in the Seine would grow one of Europe's greatest capitals.